Norval Santana.
Good evening. Thank you for coming. Well, the future of security, that's a really broad issue, especially because we don't want to deal only with military or issues or strategic planning or defense, because we believe from what we have experienced that the best way to deal with conflicts is to avoid them, to prevent them. I've been a war correspondent for 25 years, so I know what I'm talking about. When a conflict starts, there's not much to do about it, apart from shooting and trying to survive and killing the enemy and destroying the targets. So one of the aspects that we want to discuss here is how to prevent conflicts from emerge. But of course, we will deal with how strategies and planning and defense has been erratic and unsuccessful in most of the times. Not all the times, but you have, for instance, Bosnia as an example of how the international intervention was necessary. And there are other, although more debatable, examples that we may address here as well. I will only remind you of a few twists just to make the point of how complex the issue is and what we should do or try to think to do about it. You remember that in the 80s, the US and Pakistan and Saudi Arabia were boosting the presence of the Mujahideen in Afghanistan to fight the Soviets successfully. The Soviet army crumbled in Afghanistan, and that was part of the reason why Soviet Union doesn't exist anymore. But then soon after that, Al-Qaeda turned against the US, and then later on, we had the Taliban situation. Now in Syria, we had, after the start of the demonstrations, people fighting for or demonstrating for democracy and freedom. Bashar al-Assad released jihadists in order to make true his claim that he was facing terrorists. And now we have this situation in northern Syria. These people have been supported by American allied, if not regimes or countries, at least families in the Gulf. And you have now, after what happened in Ukraine and Russia, trying to reassert its position after being subject to sanctions from the US and Europe and being a bit isolated. You have now Russian warplanes, American warplanes, American allied warplanes flying a few meters from each other over Syria. And on the ground, you have such a group as the Islamic State and other groups, similar groups. And turning to the second aspect of all this, it is very intriguing for all of us, I'm sure. How come that a group like the Islamic State is able to recruit young people? And not only in Arab or in Muslim countries, but everywhere. It's something that I've been close to the Islamic State. I've been close to people who have been recruited, and I myself don't have the answer. I mean, how much frustration and a sense of abandonment and of not belonging was able to create this situation, right? So this is what we'll be tackling here, and several other aspects, of course. We are in Africa, where Africa has been also dealing with situations translated into its context. You know, you have Boko Haram, you have the insurgents in Mali, and we will be dealing with that as well. In where I come from, Latin America, this aggressiveness, this frustration, this violence is channeled through another kind of insecurity, which is the urban criminality, drug trafficking, and the violence on the streets. And that happens in other parts of the world as well. And all this has to do with security. Before introducing our panelists, we will do a cloud. So if you could please pick up your devices. And you will be writing one word, just one word, answering the question, when you think about national security or about the future of security as a whole, not only national security, what one word comes to mind? So please write that for us. So we have holistic, in the sense that it should take in globally in several aspects. Surveillance, of course. Energy has to do with security. Stability, threat, of course. It's a threat. And people, peace, poverty, army. These are the conventional concepts. Prosperity, yeah, holistic has been voted. Climate, peace, unstable, land. So I think the winners are threat. You have borders as well. Prosperity, climate, peace, holistic, and disruption. Borders. Cool. We'll go back to that one at the end of the session, and we'll do that exercise again and see if something has changed after our conversation. Now again, keep your devices because we will do another exercise, which is, and this is a warm-up for all of us. And our question is, and then you have 4 alternatives to answer. What should be the primary focus for preventing conflict in the future? Strengthening communities and families, providing employment and education, better law enforcement and military capacity building, and better intelligence sharing and capabilities. I'm sure that most of you think that all these things are important. We just want to know what is the priority, what should be done first of all, or as the most important thing. Wow. Providing employment and education got 60%. So that makes me think that somehow we are on a right track. Yeah, 20% for strengthening communities and families, which is more or less on the same path, yes. And better intelligence sharing and capabilities, only 11%, and 9% for better law enforcement and military capacity. Thank you very much for your participation. And I will introduce you our panel, which I'm very enthusiastic about. It's really, these 4 people together, they will be able to give us the whole picture of this subject. I'll start by Ambassador Jean-David Levitte. He was the one who was there when there was September 11, 2001. France was at the presidency of the Security Council. And he was the one who was leading the process of drafting 2 resolutions to allow the US to attack Afghanistan for harboring terrorist groups. That was a new thing in the international law, Afghanistan being a member of the system. But then 1.5 years later, the Iraqi crisis caught the ambassador as the ambassador of France in Washington. And then he was in the role of frustrating the US this time, after having supported them, to explain why France was against that invasion. And in 2011, when the Arab Spring happened and started, and there was this discussion about the NATO intervention in Libya, he was an advisor of then President Sarkozy, and he was there to explain to Ban Ki-moon, for instance, the Secretary General, why there should be an intervention. And in Mali, he was there with President Sarkozy as well, after the war. Well, let's turn to Aminata Touré. She's, of course, from Senegal, the special envoy of the president to the president of Senegal. She has been a justice minister, and when she fought corruption in her country, and also as a prime minister after that, he was also engaged in fighting corruption and modernizing the institutions and consolidating the democracy in Senegal. Prior to that, she worked for 22 years in the United Nations, and from those 11 years, she was engaged in leading the agenda on human rights and gender issues at the UN Population Fund. Here with me also Ambassador Assia Ben Salah Alaoui. She is the ambassador at large of the King of Morocco, and she's the co-president of the Office of Economic Cooperation for the Mediterranean and the Middle East. She has also worked as a professor of international law at the University Mohammed V and co-president of the high-level advisory group on the dialogue between peoples and cultures. I have picked up only a few things of their careers, which I thought were more relevant to our discussion, but these people have done many other things. And then last but not least, Mr. Gregory Craig. He is a leading lawyer in the US. As a student already, he was a prominent activist against the Vietnam War, which I bring the issue here because it's relevant. But then he was aide to Senator Edward Kennedy, and he was at the staff of the State Department during Bill Clinton's administration before he became an assistant to the President Clinton. And after that, he was a counsel of President Barack Obama. In that role, he drafted 2 orders, one against the use of torture in the prisons, and the other one for the closure of Guantanamo prison, which, as we all know, did not materialize. Okay, why don't we start with Ambassador Assia Ben Salah Alaoui. You are coming from Madrid. You were at a meeting of NATO there, the Western Alliance. And I wonder if you could tell us about the NATO role at the moment and how this can be improved.
Well, I think I wasn't really expecting to talk about NATO. It's not my role, even if it has to do with our Atlantic basin, since you do have in the north this community security, which is lacking in the south, and you are getting more integrated with the TTIP, which is being negotiated while we are still fragmented in the southern Atlantic. Well, I think it was a as we say, operation about NATO. NATO is broke. NATO doesn't want to do, facing some very crucial and urgent questions. And it seems to me, as an outsider, that they are seeking for how, to better communicate, to convince public opinion to be more generous for the budget of defense, which are really decreasing at a very moment where they have come in with quite a new toolkit that they have tried to sell us, and especially to sell to the members, of course, so they can advocate for that. To tell you the truth, it wasn't that clear, because unfortunately it seems it's still in the making, and we had a huge presentation by the general in charge of North NATO, and the other one knowing Admiral Ferguson for the South. And of course, it was all very attractive and trying, to say what NATO could do. What I heard, what I have kept, from this meeting, is that, of course, this frustration, that there is a lot of threats, and they are completely, taken up now by what they call the East and the South. And there was even the political advisor of the general who raised the Arctic.
Would you
which is
say
the
they're
new one.
paralyzed now?
Not paralyzed, but it seemed to me that they have learned lessons from disasters of a few previous interventions. The one of Libya was very much discussed, and especially there was a Libyan who was really opposing very fiercely about the mess that is now in Libya, and the previous others. And they said that probably for the decade to come, there would be no intervention, but they still have to do something. So they are carrying out huge maneuvers with 35,000 people and with hundreds of ships and aircrafts and so forth. And I think they really need to reflect how to do things, how to get the support for the legitimacy of their move, and how, really to go about it. But apparently, they lack the insights about the cultural background, and they did say it. They said that they are at a loss in front of what's happening southern the Mediterranean. And this feeling I had even in Brussels, for the refugee, because I was, before Madrid, I was in Brussels, and of course, which is Europe stuck in the refugee things.
Okay.
And to tell you the truth, I feel very concerned, because when I see this huge potential of knowledge, of expertise, of power together, and totally impotent in front of a few issues, incapable to prioritize. In Europe, we had 3 heads of states in Brussels, 4 prime ministers, 5 commissioners, a lot of people, and nobody had the first idea how to go about the present crisis, which is really a problem. Just to make the balance, that let alone what we, smaller states in a fragmented space, when we're in front of such mighty challenges, you can imagine.
I will turn back to you to explore this other side of this, but I would like to listen to Ambassador Levitt. You were involved in the NATO intervention in Libya. What do you make of it? Was it the right thing to do, and how do you see what happened later?
It's a difficult question. If you intervene, you are blamed. If you don't intervene, you are blamed. We were blamed because we went to Libya. We are blamed because we are not enough present in Syria, which is a mess. If I had to choose to be a citizen of Libya or to be a citizen of Syria today, I would prefer to be a citizen of Libya, because in Syria you have nearly 300,000 dead and millions of displaced persons. Now, about Libya, why this intervention? Simply because Gaddafi had announced that he would eradicate opposition. He would kill the rats, as he said, in Benghazi and elsewhere. So the question for us, we were in a position to do something to prevent it. Should we do something or not? And at that moment, President Sarkozy asked me, what happened in Srebrenica? And I explained, I was with Chirac at the time, I said 8,000 dead. And he told me, look, if we don't interfere, if we don't act, in Benghazi there will be 80,000 dead. And I think he was right. So let's remember that we unanimously adopted in 2005 at the UN summit what we call the responsibility to protect. That is, when a president, a leader, is not protecting his own people, but killing his own people, then it is the responsibility of the international community to do something. Of course, we had to do it after a call from the people of Libya, with the support of the Arab League, with the permission of the Security Council, and with an alliance, NATO, but also 3 Arab countries. And I think it was a success story at the time. Now it's a mess. Why is it a mess? Not because of the military action, but because when it ended, the new leaders told us, thank you so much. Now we are free people,
Oh.
We will build
Now you can go
a
home.
beautiful democracy. Please go home, and let us provide democracy for our own people. And it started well. The first elections were free and fair, and a moderate majority was elected. And then slowly it derailed. So if there is one lesson to be learned from Libya, it is finish the job. Not alone, with the international community. And I'm a great admirer and supporter of Bernardino Leon, who is doing his best to build bridges between the different factions and build a government.
And how about Syria? What should be done now?
Syria, my idea is, well, you had one success story this summer, last summer. On the 14th of July, the P5+1 and Iran agreed on a very important agreement about the nuclear military program of Iran. It took 10 years of hard work. It is a great success. So let's take the same group, the P5+1, invite at the table Turkey, Iran, Saudi Arabia, which are the regional powers which can make a difference. And together, let's think of the way forward. That's what is more or less happening today and in the coming days in Vienna. So let's cross fingers and hope for the best.
Aminata Touré, what went wrong in Libya and what should not be repeated?
Well, thank you very much. What I like with this meeting is we can just speak our mind and don't beat around the bush. I am from Senegal, not very far from Mali. Mali almost disappeared when the jihadists came, and thanks to the intervention of France, and later on, the ECOWAS troops and Senegalese contributed, things were managed. So if you ask a Malian citizen whether they regret Gaddafi, they will tell you yes, very much. So there was a question in the previous panel asking, the audience how to solve issues. Mm-hmm. First of all, if we don't have a clear plan, let's think about it first. Meaning, before we go and take dictator right center down, let's have a plan, which we didn't have, obviously. So we ended up in a mess. Mm-hmm. So that's the lesson we have to learn, all of us.
And what should be done then?
So I'm coming there. Because if we are talking about fighting terrorism, my view is we are having a too narrow approach to it. Mr. Ambassador, you talk about the Security Council to take the authorization from the Security Council, from the Arab League, etc. It's very important, but it's not enough. You say it, if we want to fight terrorism, first let's prevent it. And to prevent it, it's the question that you ask on the board, and people are aware that you need to make sure that young people are educated, they got jobs, you have to make sure that, people have, because the most dangerous person is somebody who has nothing to lose. Yeah. And that's where most of young folks in Africa found themselves. Mm-hmm. And if we are not safe, they're going to cross the Sahara, they're going to go to France, and they're going to prevail in Europe, etc., etc. Mm-hmm. So there is one thing maybe the jihadists will do good for us. One maybe unique thing. They're going to foster international solidarity because we are in it together. Mm-hmm. So let's learn that lesson, that now what we need to do is to make sure that countries that are vulnerable have something to live up for, especially young people.
It's one
young
word.
People seems to be, for me, the centerpiece of the equation. Most of young people, it would be interesting to do a research. Who are they? Those who go and join the jihadists.
Yeah.
Jobless, not educated, no prospect, no future. Until we address that, we are not going to solve the issue because it's not only a military issue. It is, partially, because there is no dialogue with those groups, for sure. But they keep reinventing themselves because the fuel is coming, and the fuel is this huge batch of young people with no future.
Yeah,
so employment seems to be, for me, one key element to solve the issue. But we don't have the good structural institution to do that. If I come back to the UN, you have the Security Council, you talk about it. But they don't want to talk about employment. They don't want to talk about economy. They don't want to talk about fighting poverty. These are soft issues to be left to ECOSOC, the Economic and Social Council. So if we keep having this two-track parallel approach, we're not going to solve issues. We're going to delay them.
Okay, we'll go deeper into that. And Mr. Gregory Craig, and how do we deal with these people who have already enlisted, who are already fighting, and who not necessarily carry a national flag? And how does a national state and enforcement apparatus can legally deal with this sort of challenge?
Let me just comment first on the NATO observation, because I think at a time when we're talking so much about unconventional threats to national security, such as the one you just described, it's useful to remember that there are still very many conventional threats to national security that we have to worry about, that require, for example, a powerful navy establishing the freedom of the seas, or that result in an army being formed in the middle of Iraq and Syria that marches across the plain and takes cities. It requires NATO to go to the borders of Europe to defend Europe in the event of Russian invasion. So it seems to me that there are still conventional threats out there to the national security, in addition to the unconventional ones, and that NATO in Afghanistan, in the Baltics, has behaved very, very well. And in fact, what it wanted to do, it accomplished in Libya. The plan may have been absent. The plan was, in fact, a humanitarian plan to save people from being killed. That happened. What followed on was no plan at all, and that was the disaster. So it seems to me it's difficult to blame NATO itself. Maybe it's the governments that were involved in it. On the question that you asked, what's happened, of course, in the world of globalization and this new technology is that central governments have become much less powerful and less effective at controlling their populations. And individuals have been much more effective in communicating, crossing borders. And in that respect, and this was, I guess, sort of a political saying, personal security has now become national security. It's all about individuals being able to influence events, much more so than governments. And there's been a proliferation of non-state actors that require multiple states to respond. Now, you asked the question about legality. I think one of the primary challenges that states that are concerned about terrorists coming into their borders, one of the primary concerns should be educating our own publics about what's going on, and having that education filled with some reality as to how individual citizens can react. So it's not just about governments taking action or police forces taking action, but individuals are aware of the threat as well.
But then there are two opposite trends. One of the words which were there was borders. One trend is, well, let's put up borders and block people from crossing because they are threatening our security. And the other trend would be, let's let people develop themselves, come, at least in an organized way, and we should spread prosperity so that we wouldn't deal with this in such a serious way. Which approach do you choose?
Well, I don't agree with your juxtaposition of the two options. If you talk about, for example, the really terrible immigration problems, the refugee problems, fleeing the civil war in Syria in the hundreds of thousands, I think this is a real failure of the international community not to have seen this coming. A great achievement by the Jordanians, the Lebanese, to take in the displaced people from the Syrian civil war, and an utter failure in the Atlantic community, the northern Atlantic community, to anticipate that the Libyans and the Syrians were going to head into Europe. And so then you have an uncontrolled response and an individualistic, politicized response from each country, which I regret results in a change of politics, a change of policy, And I think we need a much more coherent and coordinated international response to that particular event, the refugees flowing into Europe.
Okay, so why don't we take some questions from the audience? And there are two ways to do that. You can write in your devices, and we will be asking your questions and addressing them. At the same time, we can take some questions, oral questions from the audience, and I'll take like 4 questions, and then I return to them, and then back. Okay, so we have first there. Yeah. Microphone is coming. Yeah. Okay. I have someone there and then here.
Good afternoon.
Please identify yourself.
Yes. My name is Fidel Sandagorta. I come from Spain. And I was a bit surprised by this root causes of terrorism focusing to poverty and the absence of jobs. I mean, the root causes debate has been going for 14 years since 9/11, and I thought we were already over this thing that I think misses really the point, because there is poverty and there is unemployment in Latin America, and there is no terrorism. And I think we have to see that this is ideological factor. The important factor is ideological, and it has to do with an inspiration of a certain trend of Islam. And if we don't look at that, we are completely blind to this phenomenon. And I think, thank you.
Okay, I got your point. So there was there. He was the second on this gentleman here. Then I turn to you, and then.
Yeah, thank you, Peter Kellner from the UK. I wanted to build in precisely on that point. The people in 9/11 who flew the planes into the World Trade Center, they weren't poor or ill-educated. Mm-hmm. In London in July 2005, the people who killed 50 people on London's transport system, they were educated people. They were people like teachers. A lot of the people going from Britain and other countries to Syria are actually educated. So while, yes, in the long run, maybe jobs and education are a vital part of it, I would invite the panel to say, do we really not have an existential struggle between liberal democracy and the forces who, many of whom are quite well off, are actually opposed to liberal democracy? And should people like me be less squeamish about being rich white northerners? Should we defer less to people who say, oh, well, the world is full of different cultures, and actually say, if the world is going to get along together, we've actually got to win the arguments about liberal democracy?
Okay, thank you. So we had someone there, back to the back. I'll take only 4 now, but you have the chance to, okay? I'll come back to you later on. Yes, please. Yeah. Please identify yourself.
Yes. I'm Seth Stoddard. I'm an Assistant Secretary of Homeland Security in the United States. And I want to follow up on the Libya question and actually but change the geography to Iraq and Syria, which is you said that the issue with Libya is that we didn't finish the job in some sense. Should the United States and the coalition partners have finished the job in Iraq, and would that have prevented the rise of ISIS, A? And B, if the answer to that is yes, how do you develop political and public support for that kind of open-ended, large-scale commitment in the United States or in the West to finishing the job if you're going to intervene in these places around the world?
Okay, thanks. And now here in the front, I'll turn back to you later on. Here. Okay. Please identify yourself.
I'm Alfredo Valadao, professor at Sciences Po and OCP Policy Center fellow. It seems that everybody agrees that in some circumstances you have to intervene. You cannot do it otherwise. But you have to finish the job, and I do absolutely agree with you. But to finish the job, to have a plan, it means that you have to stay in, as our friend there said. You have to stay in. As a former U.S. Defense Secretary said, you get in, you own the country.
Yeah.
So, a very specific question to this kind of attitude has a legal form in the UN Charter, which is the protectorate. Should we, again, put this legal form, or this concept, back again in the international relations, with all that that means in neocolonialism, whatever, but should we put together this idea that in some occasions you need a protectorate, which means also to have public opinion behind you.
Okay, thank you, Professor. So, Dr. Aminata Touré, they do have a point. Not all terrorists are poor or unemployed. People from the middle class are recruited as well. So that's why in the beginning I was talking about frustration and other maybe psychological or social elements, but what do you think about it?
Well, of course, I speak to my context. I speak to my environment. I speak to what I know. And that would be interesting to do some research as to why some young folks from Mali left to the south and want to sell their services to the jihadists. That would be interesting to know. How come north of Nigeria, that happen to be the poorest part, they're the one benefiting the less from the oil? It's not by random that you have Boko Haram there too. So I think we have to be very modest in assessing the situation. It's not one size fits all. There are different reasons. I can give you one reason. My son is a Hassan, my husband is a Umar. I can tell you when they have to pass security in different airports in Europe or Italy or the US, randomly they spend more time. Randomly. So obviously the reason in Europe or in the US has to do a lot with frustration, with also unemployment. I have nephews who live in France who are in the suburbs sitting from morning to evening doing nothing, and then they got attracted to extreme discourse. These are realities we are facing. Of course, according to different contexts, you have different reasons. But I can tell you that in West Africa, if you look into the dynamics, it really has to do with exclusion. And exclusion means you're not a consumer, because we are living in an iPhone society. Mm-hmm. You won't be able to get married. And then, one thing we are forgetting is the poor of yesterday are not the poor of today. Most young people go to school, have a certain intellectual level, and they don't accept to just sit and do nothing. Mm-hmm. So, and that's the problem, because we have to look at security differently. You have to make sure that you address the needs of the people so they don't fall into extreme frustration that leads to extremism at the whole. That's the point I was making.
Ambassador Alaoui, there is a certain radical narrative which takes the Islam as, uses Islam for this narrative, and there is this element. How do you address this issue?
Well, I would like just to come back to the reasons, which are really multiple. And indeed, we do have educated people who are seduced by radicalism and extremism. And there is a romantic dimension as well to it. Mm-hmm. And there is a huge anger, an anger which is a legacy of colonialism, just name it, of double standards, of humiliation, of Palestine. Right. Let's not forget that Palestine is a central cause in the heart of all the Muslims and all the Arabs, even if it's not expressed. And when we see the deterioration there and nothing being done. So if we have to take a few lessons, for global security, personal security, human security, and security at large, collective security, we have to address the real conflict. Of course, there are a lot of traditional conflicts which are not resolved, which are often conflicts. Nobody wants to deal with them. Mm-hmm. We have to address them. And there is this huge anger and frustration of people who are excluded. And here I would like to answer my friend who talked about liberal democracy, and I'm coming back to Huntington, clash of civilization. I'm really sorry to tell you that liberal democracies are not delivering to their own citizens. And they are certainly not delivering to their own citizens when they are from immigration descent in Europe You have, to be a Muhammad or a Larbi, you don't get decent, lodging, and you still have discrimination. If it's not de jure, de facto. So this makes a difference as well, and this is important. So when we speak, exclusion is absolutely basic. And I would like here to make the link for which the United Nations has been fighting for the last 60 years, but with very mixed results. It's the basic link between development and security. You have to give to societies, to people at large, and to the young in particular, real stakes in their own societies. So they care about security. And these unconventional threats have to be addressed very much like this. We have seen this in Morocco, where the population has been instrumental in information, in going after people who were preparing something, and so forth. Okay. The people have to feel that they are not left, on the side, and they are not excluded. Not only human security, but as well political participation is absolutely
key.
It's absolutely key. And when I speak about liberal democracy, you see the anger from Indignidos to Podemos to Occupy Wall Street. It's across the world. Okay. And we see the youth looking for a cause to defend. And that's why, it's extremely complex, because you have multi-layer security and it seems to me that the rise of non-state actors, which have been very much empowered by failed states, by poor governance, and that's what gave them such importance, is absolutely crucial.
Okay.
We have to deal, with this transnational, and especially in our region.
Ambassador Levitt, when the Libyans told you, go home now, we are okay, should you have stayed? What do you do? And that's a question for Gregory Craig as well. He can answer later. Should we change the legal framework and go back to the protection issue?
I will answer your question. I'd like to answer the questions which were addressed to us in a way. And building on what you just, both of you said, I'm puzzled by one question. In France, you have recruitment of young people, not always Muslim, but they become Muslims, and they join the jihad of the Islamic State. And this didn't exist with Al-Qaeda. So personally, I asked myself, why? And I think that the answer, but it's a conversation, the answer is that Al-Qaeda wants to destroy. The Islamic State pretends that they want to build. They want to build a caliphate, and they propose a future, a mission to these young, disenfranchised boys and girls in our poor suburbs or in your cities. And I think we have to address this question because, for me, that's the great danger. Now, our friend from the State Department mentioned Iraq.
Home security, actually. Yeah.
I think there was one mistake made. We were against the war, but okay, that's past. But one mistake was made by Paul Bremer. That is, he decided to push aside the state structures of Iraq as they existed. He sent back all the soldiers with their arms but no money, all the policemen with their arms but no money, in their homes. And guess what? They were not happy. And it started a process of revolt against the new order. And then, you know the story. So the third question was, okay, and it's your question, about Libya. Should we contemplate again the possibility to put under UN or regional organization protectorate failed countries? And my answer is yes. That's exactly what we did in 1991 with Cambodia. remember that for Cambodia, we had a negotiation where China and the USSR, Europe and the United States, the regional powers, approved a plan which put under protectorate the whole country of Cambodia. The flag was blue for the blue of the UN, with Angkor as a symbol. And we sent troops to maintain law and order, disarm the different military forces, organize free and fair elections, and through this process, the Khmer Rouge were ousted, defeated. Maybe we should contemplate the same kind of protectorate in a different set, a different world, and that's maybe the mistake we made when we listened too much to our friend who said, "Thank you so much, please go home, we'll do the job."
But is that possible, Gregory Craig? Legally, can you stay when the owner of the house is telling you, okay, go home now?
Well, it's a political problem as much as a legal problem. But I'd like to address the question about young Arabs or even non-Arabs who join the jihad. I'm probably the least equipped person to speak with any authority or understanding as to what motivates young people to join, whether they're rich, well-educated and angry, or whether they're poor, unemployed and angry. What motivates them to join a jihadist organization or participate in ISIS or in Al-Qaeda. But it does seem to me that that's a problem that the United States of America is badly equipped to address itself, and that the United States, people should not look to the United States or Americans for the way in which young Arabs or young angry Muslims should be persuaded not to join these organizations. This is a real challenge, I think, for the Muslim community, the Islamic community, the Arab community, and that's why I don't believe it's a fight for the soul of the world between liberal democracy and militant, fundamentalist religious organizations. I think it's a fight for the soul of Islam, and Islam has got to be very much engaged. Those who don't want the jihad to be the byword and the slogan of the future of Islam have got to get more engaged, and the West has got to support those efforts. Now, on the question of, from the Homeland Security, there were political problems as many as legal problems associated not only just with Iraq, but also with Libya. And the problems political were that the Americans wanted to leave unless there was an adequate understanding with the Iraqi government, and Maliki was not having any of it. And so the question was, were the Americans going to stay on even without a status of forces agreement? They probably could have done that, but it would have been very, very difficult to do politically. And those who now blame the United States' decision to depart Iraq, blame the Obama administration for the creation of ISIS, I think, are missing the entire point as to the failures of the Iraqi government itself to fulfill the promises that they'd had to have representation and of diversity in the government itself. So, it's easy to blame and to destroy. It's difficult to take responsibility and build.
Okay. So we are...
Do we have the political will in the West to finish jobs like this?
To finish a job?
To finish the job, sort of all along the political will to publics in the West.
The public opinion.
It's the staying power to stay in these places for long periods of time.
Well, it's difficult to...
Very briefly, please. We have other questions.
I think you have to have a plan that has a prospect of success. And if you ask that question after we've been in a place for 7 or 8 years, or 9 or 10, look at Afghanistan now. It's 11 or 12 years that we've been there. I think nobody can say that we haven't had stick-to-itiveness in our policy to Afghanistan. It continues. So I don't think you can generalize conceptually that the Americans don't have the ability to stick to a course of action. there are impediments that get in the way that make it more difficult, and many of those impediments are local politics at home that make it impossible for a president of the United States to take decisions that he otherwise might want to take.
Okay, so we are approaching the end. So what I'm going to do is this. We have some questions or comments which were tapped into your devices, and I'll have a read of those, and I get two previous questions that I will address, and then I will ask you to already make your conclusions, your final considerations. One is for the Ambassador Levit. What drives French citizens to join the Islamic State and also at the same time to perpetrate the Charlie Hebdo attacks on French soil? Okay, with climate change driving ever more people from their homeland, is the refugee crisis going to be the new normal? Someone mentioned that even in Syria there was a climate aspect of the conflict. Before entering a theater and focusing on direct threats, should we not identify their root cause and fight them with a planned strategy? And education and employment do not offer short-term solution. What do we do now? Okay, so we had the questions from previously asked from her, and then from the young man who was, and unfortunately I'll have to let our speakers make their conclusions. So your turn, please. Here, please.
Thank you. I am afraid sometimes when people believe that in Latin America we don't have terrorism, because of course there are different motivations for terrorists, religious motivations, and sometimes what we have suffered in Colombia, for example, is the FARC guerrilla. The FARC guerrilla, they were supposed to be a kind of social movement in order to improve conditions of life for poor people in Colombia, but they start 50 years ago. But the last 30 years or 35 years, they have been working with the narco-traffickers, and they have made a lot of terrorism in Colombia. But somebody said there is no terrorism in Latin America, and this naive attitude makes sometimes that the countries and the social community has a very low standards to control and to prevent this kind of terrorism, because of course terrorism is when you use plastic explosives, and when you put a bomb in a club, when you made through non-traditional arms attacks to civil populations. So yes, we have terrorism in Latin America. This is the same like ETA in Spain or France. So we have to be very clear about the concepts, because we need to have an international cooperation to prevent and also in order to stop this kind of movements who are doing terrorism.
Okay.
Many examples, but the United Nations Security Council, maybe the resolution 1373, it says that governments have to combat terrorism, and they have to cooperate each others in order to avoid that these terrorist groups move in the borders. And this is something that we also suffer in Colombia, that the Venezuelan government has supported a lot the terrorist movements in Colombia.
Okay, thanks very much. So the young man there. And this
Is it working? Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Please identify yourself.
Please be patient with my voice. It's also new to me. Well, I would go.
Who are you?
Yassine. My name is Yassine Mustanjidi. I'm an architect and urban planner, and I'm part of the Immersion Leaders program.
Okay.
I would go back to your introduction. I find it quite fascinating because it gave us the opportunity to go back a little bit to our recent history. But what came back to my mind is this saying from Einstein. He said that insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. What happened in Afghanistan, using local militias to get rid of enemies, is the same thing that happened in Syria. It's the same thing that happened in Iraq with Saddam. And there's another error or mistake that happened over and over again, and that's what Mr. Ambassador has said. He said that you went to bomb Libya because Gaddafi threatened to kill the opposition, And in my view, the opposition was killed many times, especially while supporting these dictators for so many years because of public security or whatever.
Okay, thanks very
Who
much.
shall we blame for that?
We don't have much time, so
just
please
one last thing
finish. Yeah.
about terrorism. It's good to talk about military terrorism, but I'm also wondering how about financial terrorism, what happened in the economic crisis. That was also, for me, some kind of terrorism.
As I say, it's a broad issue. Dr. Aminata Touré, your final thoughts.
Yes, I think we should keep this conversation going in many places because we are thinking loudly. I think we need to make sure that we understand the deep causes of why these young people are upset and angry. Of course, there is some civilization dialogues going on. I think we need to support also in countries that are concerned, including in the West, moderate Islam. We didn't talk about that. I'm from Senegal, where we are very moderate. We are 98% Muslim. We are moderate. Our first president was a Christian, supported by Muslim religious leaders. So we know what we're talking about. But what we are seeing is groups of young people who are very excluded, and this is a reality. They have master degrees, PhDs, sitting home doing nothing, and getting very upset. And these are threats to countries, so we need to address that. When I heard about finishing the business, I almost jumped from my seat. Let's think it twice before we go that route, because the last thing we want is to have moderate Muslim jumping to defend their countries against imperialism, etc., etc. So it's a very complex situation. So one side doesn't fit all. Let's think about it.
Okay, Ambassador Levitt.
Well, it's a fascinating debate, and thank you very much for organizing. So thank you for both organizations to give us the privilege of this conversation. Madam Minister, you're right, of course. There are different types of terrorism, and not only Muslim type of terrorism. And as it was said, it happened that I was the chair of the Security Council on 9/11. And I could not join Paris, so we had to invent something. And our idea was, it was obvious that it was a defining moment for the international community as a whole. And my preoccupation was not to have the US fight alone against the scourge of terrorism. And so we wanted to build a coalition with the whole international community. So it led to the resolution that you mentioned. And it still exists. Should we do more? Of course. So congratulations for the peace process, which is leading to, I hope, a great success story after so many years. And the whole international community should help you. For us, we are in the same boat in a way, because you have the consequences, we have the consequences of the same problem. The lesson, it seems to me, we learned is that state structures are important. When they have disappeared, you cannot build them again. Look at Somalia. How will we rebuild the state structures of Somalia? And that's the message we learned in Iraq, in a way, and that's what we should keep in mind when we think about Syria. Because one thing is certain for us, French, Bashar al-Assad must go. The moment to be debated. But the state structures of Syria, the administration, the army, what is left of the army, the police, should stay. Because if they disappear, then it will be quite impossible to rebuild the state structures.
That's what happened in Iraq. Yeah.
Yeah, and one thing is important too, is borders. The problem we have in Sahel is that borders are difficult to control. And so you have all these networks, not only terrorists, but traffickers of drugs, money, human beings, all these networks working with the terrorists. And you, I heard you blame us because we intervene in Libya, but
You
I
should
think
just have
you
a plan, I said.
but you were happy that we intervened in Mali. I heard you.
Mr. Craig,
And-
they're starting discussing each other, so I will give the word to you
And so
to appease things.
It's difficult.
It is.
I just have two very quick comments. The first is I don't think this session should go to completion without noticing the very positive developments in Vienna, where the Russians and the Americans have convened a group of people to negotiate the Syrian situation. Most meaningfully, I think, is the Russian desire to reach out to the Saudis, the Russian willingness to talk to the Free Syrian Army, the Russian willingness to confront Assad about a possible political solution. And to have all those people in the same room in Vienna should tell us a little bit about the importance of multinational solutions and the use of diplomacy. That's point one. Point two, we've talked a lot about conventional threats to security as well as unconventional threats to security, and we really have left out climate change and all the consequences that flow from climate change, which I think the people in our defense establishment have identified as one of the most serious threats to our national security.
Okay, Ambassador Alawi.
Well, we have said that conflict prevention was not that good, but post-conflict rehabilitation is even worse. Unfortunately, we don't know how to do that. So my message, if I have message, even if I'm a bit frustrated, I wish we had concentrated a little bit about the Atlantic basin, because the huge challenges and the heterogeneity, the diversity that we are facing there requires much more on the states themselves to do, and they have to be supported to do that, to take care of eliminating the disparities, which are absolutely destructive and which will destroy everything, and especially that they are going to grow with the climate change and with the threats on water scarcity, on food security in our region, and these are absolutely basic. And second, I wish we see a few very timid South-South cooperation, which is trying to get organized. I wish it could be very much encouraged. And I wish that the cooperation, which is positive, that we're having with the powers and with our partners, could be done better in different ways. And I wish even that the emerging partnering between US and the EU in Africa, for instance, in a few spots, could really move from dialogue about partnership to concrete actions. And this is the difficult part of it, how you build real security, concrete security for people, for their everyday life. This is absolutely basic. How you organize cooperative security and collective security. This is really the challenge that we are facing. We are taking on this arc of crisis that has been expanding. Just a word about, you said the difference why ISIS is doing differently. Because they have the reverse of the strategy of Al-Qaeda. They first took the territory, and from the territory they want to expand. They want to have the caliphate across the Muslim world, and they want to govern the world from Australia to Canada, and they have been trying. So the problem is that we have really to prevent this from the root. How are we going to do it? This is my basic question, and we are not moving towards that. I'm not as optimistic as Ambassador Levitt about. I'm happy that they are talking to each other. It's
Okay.
better than not. But still, we are far away, from resolving the Syrian crisis. But we have to keep a very open eye on what's happening in the Sahel, in the arc of crisis, because ISIS have been linking with the local terrorist group and expanding its own strategy, which is create maximum material damage and maximum victim, regardless. The strategy has differed from. And with all the local groups now paying allegiance to ISIS or to the revival of Al-Qaeda, we're having as well a shift in the strategy. So we have a shift, a paradigm shift that we have really to address. And all that we have been talking about is that we are to focus as well on the threats that are on our doorsteps.
Yeah.
And the countries which are trying hard, as mine, we have not been talking about this comprehensive global strategy,
There are so many issues to
unfortunately.
address. Yeah.
But I
We'll
think
keep
it's
talking, though.
extremely important, to counter extremism, because the exclusion is probably, the worst thing that a young can live today. No future.
Yeah.
How can you live the present if you have no prospect for the future? So
Yeah.
really, we should support
We will.
the endeavors, of the people and do perhaps better
We
interact
must-
on these subjects.
We will keep talking about that. Thank you so much. Let's give applause to our panelists. Thank you.